So sometime in the late 1730s in the Rue Saint-Severin, Paris, the funniest thing that ever happened in the working life of one Nicolas Contat, an apprentice in a printing shop, was the riotous, bloody and somewhat ritualistic slaughter of the cats of the neighborhood. The incident was reenacted over the following days to peals of laughter, growing ever more humorous in the retelling. Indeed, the hilarity of the episode was so pronounced that the worker would still be writing about the incident some 20 years later. To modern readers, especially in these allophilic times, the treatment of these poor animals seems barbaric, even repulsive, not to say very unfunny. And this episode is, of course, the subject, although not exclusively, of Robert Danton's classic work of cultural history, The Great Cat Massacre. Danton shows us how jokes, even or in fact especially when we don't get them, can open up lines of inquiry and understanding that otherwise may seem inaccessible. Dante encourages us to look at who is laughing and for what reasons, suggesting that humour can illuminate our understanding of the worldviews of those in the past, as the apprentice invert power relationships between themselves and their master, and his mistress, it should be said as well. He also asks us to place these instances of hilarity in wider context, to see what traditions and discourses the jokes are part of. In short, to not only understand the joke, but to see what social function it plays. So all this is by way of clumsy introduction to another cat, amongst other characters, some 2.5 centuries later in post-industrial Manchester rather than pre-industrial Paris. And at this point, I should apologise for my French and also provide a content warning for some of the material I will present. The feline in question goes by the name of Tough Shit Thomas. So Thomas was a character drawn primarily by Michael Linnell, an illustrator who created a series of comics for harm reduction charity Lifeline during the 1980s through to the 1990s. And I should also say that as I kick off this workshop with the collections panel, that many of these materials are available in normal times in the Drugscope collection at the Wellcome Library. So Lifeline had been formed in 1971 by psychiatrist Eugenie Cheesemond and ex-user Rowdy Yates. Initially started as a, quote, therapeutic soup kitchen, offering food and a place to crash. For drug users by the 1980s, Lifeline had expanded its services and was providing harm reduction advice. Its approach was avowedly agnostic, working alongside drug users and believing their consumption to be neither, quote, altogether good nor bad. These principles contrasted with official government campaigns such as 1985's Heroin Screws You Up, or 1990's Drugs, the Effects Can Last Forever, which drugs workers had criticised as scaremongering, warning that such initiatives, quote, alienated users from the help and information sources they might someday require, and which I think Alex Mould will be discussing in one of tomorrow's panels. So Lifeline aimed to address drug users on their own terms. It started using the medium of comics to do so in 1987. I mentioned Tough Shit Thomas, not only to provide an ungainly segue from Danton's Cat Massacre, but also because the first character to appear in Smack in the Eye, which took its cues from 1960s US underground comics, that's with an X, such as Gilbert Shelton's fabulous Furry Freak Brothers, which not only featured risque countercultural humour and copious marijuana smoke, but also Fat Freddys Cat. Indeed, cats of literally all stripes were a key trope in comic book culture. If you think of Garfield or Calvin and Hobbes' fame, perhaps mirroring the way that Danton's Cat Massacre was in a longer lineage of feline-related mischief and practical jokes, such as the German practices of Katzenmusik. So this also points to the way in which humour can sometimes function. Anthropomorphized creatures are stand-ins or conduits for expressing opinions or thoughts that their human equivalents leave unspoken. For example, in his debut strip, Thomas almost loses the last of his 9 lives by injecting heroin with a used syringe, a story with an almost tragic ending that can be played for laughs, stealthily implanting the serious message about harm reduction in the reader's mind. But Smack in the Eye also featured plenty of human characters, and it's these that I've done the most work on in the course of my research on ecstasy. So therefore, I want to concentrate on those for the remainder of my talk. But I should also mention that other strips in the first issue featured Grandpa Smackhead Jones, advising his grandsons that smoking heroin was less risky than injecting, as well as a guide to safe sex with Fanny and Dick. As you might imagine, the strong language, depictions of drug use, not to mention the explicit illustrations of sexual acts of all varieties, brought unwelcome attention to Smack in the Eye. As Linnell related to The Guardian in 1994, quote, "We were interviewed by the Director of Public Prosecutions and several agencies wrote to the Department of Health trying to get our funding stopped." But Lifeline also took care to evaluate the comics and demonstrated them to be effective, and you can read this evaluation in the Wellcome Library. So at the same time as Lifeline was pioneering this visually attractive vernacular method of providing harm reduction advice, a new breed of drug user was also emerging right around the corner from their offices in Oldham Street, Manchester. Ecstasy, or MDMA, had, from the summer of 1988 onwards, become inextricably linked with the nascent rave scene in the UK. And Manchester became a particular hotspot for this burgeoning acid house subculture, with its clubs quickly gaining national notoriety before cementing its place in cultural mythology with the 2002 film 24 Hour Party People. Indeed, pop cultural theorist Steve Redhead would write in 1983 that, quote, "Ecstasy has become almost synonymous with what has become known as Manchester." So these clubs, such as the Hacienda or Thunderdome, were a mere stone's throw from Lifeline. As Linnell put it, quote, "We basically had people out of their faces on the doorstep." So this seemingly novel substance and its attendant subculture presented new challenges to drug workers that up until this point had been somewhat preoccupied with heroin and crack users. Ravers represented, quote, "a new group of potential clients, young recreational poly drug users who frequented rave dance venues and were knowledgeable about the effects of a range of drugs, such as LSD, ecstasy, and amphetamines." So for Lifeline, ecstasy posed, quote, "real problems in working out how to respond to drug use that is an adjunct to fun and pleasure rather than the organizing force of a lifestyle." However, Lifeline used tried and tested methods with these ravers, creating a new character for Smack in the Eye and subsequent solo adventures, Peanut Pete. So based on a real life raver who had engaged with Lifeline services. Like the character he inspired, this young man had, quote, "a big nose, a head shaped vaguely like a peanut, and his baseball cap on the wrong way around." Peanut Pete's first appearance, however, in 1990, did not in fact address ecstasy, but rather acid or LSD, in a booklet called A Trip Around Manchester, in which our hero ingests purple OMS before, quote, "feeling like a paranoid pineapple as he walks around the metropolis." Significantly, though, A Trip Around Manchester, alongside its jocular tone, was embedded in the world in which its putative audience moved, referencing Manchester landmarks, both real and fictional, with Pete at one point confusedly stumbling into the Rover's Return, the pub of TV soap Coronation Street. Peanut Pete comics were distributed to record shops and hairdressers, while volunteers handed them out at clubs and raves. Next to be published was E by Gum, in which Pete, seeking respite from his low-paid job, wishes to go to a rave. A fairy godfather appears to both grant his wishes for a mountain of ease, but also warn him of the dangers of possession and taking too many at once. Again, the tone was flippant, but its narrative was grounded in the issues facing young people: poor employment prospects, low wages, the desire for consumer goods, and the generational divide, illustrated by the brusque exchanges between Pete and his father. So the humor of these comics came not only from Pete's fantastical adventures, but also the industrial language, and more importantly, the post-industrial setting. Peanut Pete parodied cliches about Northern Britain, with its references to Corrie, flat caps, and of course the titular E by Gum. Whilst a phrase perhaps more associated with the city across the Pennines, after all, as ravers used to say, you can't spell Leeds without two E's and LSD, it played and made fun of the versions of the North that were purportedly held by London-centric policymakers, drug workers, and music press alike. Again, this was about who was laughing and what they were laughing about, with Lifeline attempting to tap into regional and civic pride to connect with their audience. And indeed, Peanut Pete was an instant hit with ravers, with Lifeline producing their own Pete t-shirts after discovering clubbers were making their own bootleg versions. Attuned to the baggy apparel preferred by the scene, they were available in 3 colors, but only one size, extra large. alongside American underground comics. Smack in the Eye had also drawn heavily on Viz, the Northeast-based satirical magazine that was reaching the height of its popularity in the mid-80s and had in its turn been inspired by punk fanzines. By accident or design, Peanut Pete's escapades chimed perfectly with the tone and aesthetics of rave fanzines. So like their subcultural antecedents, fanzines such as Leeds Herb Garden, London Boys Own, and the de facto in-house fanzine of the Hacienda, Freaky Dancing, were irreverent and profanity-strewn. Many included short cartoons and discussed in ribald fashion the prevailing mores, substances, and clothing favoured by the scene. Peanut Pete's success, selling and distributing over 1 million copies in 1993 alone, pointed to both an appetite for information about safer consumption of ecstasy in the wake of well-publicised deaths, but also its transition from subcultural youth movement into a more mainstream phenomenon. Despite this popularity, Lifeline suspected that both his appearance and laddish feats were not cutting through to the significant coterie of female ravers. As Angela McRobbie has suggested, while girls appear, for example, to be less involved in the cultural production of rave, from the flyers to the events, the DJing, the emphasis in dancing, where girls were always found in subcultures, gives girls a newfound confidence and a prominence, end quote. So the specific medium of the Peanut Pete comics and its emulation of the scene's fanzines brought questions, however, about inclusivity and ideas about feminine appeal. For example, the appositely titled Boyzone was frequently accused of sexism. And as co-founder Terry Farley conceded, a line could be drawn from these fanzines to the so-called lads mags that launched in the mid-1990s. Quote, there was loads of magazines that came afterwards. Loaded, for example, totally ripped us off with an article about wanking techniques. Loaded was our enemy. So while there's a distinction here between these fanzines' boisterous humour, and it's worth mentioning that Boyzone also included an article on female masturbation, and the blatant misogyny of Loaded, it nonetheless indicates why Lifeline sought to explore other means of communicating their message. So their response was therefore to produce a series of postcards intended to, quote, mimic the glossy fashion magazine style, popular with young women, and also the flyers that advertised raves and clubs. These postcards, with black and white photography of glamorously attired women, offset by fuchsia pink typography, had a single word, intactogenic, transitions, curiosity. On the picture side, the sort of elusive phrases that might easily be mistaken for the name of a new club night. On the back, however, were the, quote, facts about ecstasy and an entreaty to remember the golden EU rule, less is more. So despite making no specific reference to gender in the postcards, the implicitly feminine aesthetic failed to chime with the women surveyed by Sheila Henderson, who was a researcher for Lifeline. Her evaluation noted that, quote, they appealed more to the trendy, fashionable type, the lone raver, lacking mass appeal, and contrary to expectations, Peanut Pete was in fact just as popular with women as much as men. So Henderson concluded that targeting health messages in a gender-sensitive manner is more complex than originally anticipated. Indeed, humour was evidently a vital ingredient of Lifeline's materials, and without it, its communications were self-conscious and stilted. So two female characters subsequently developed by Linnell and Lifeline in consultation with focus groups, described by researcher Kelly Sherlock as, quote, female versions of Peanut Pete. After considerable time, it was decided that the girls would be called Claire and Josie, who were about the same age, 17, 18, one of whom was black and one of whom was white. So the first comic, Claire and Josie Get Off Their Cake, confronted how women might navigate the apparently masculine world of raves, as well as the particular challenges that ecstasy seemingly presented to female reproductive cycles. Driving to a rave with their male friends, Claire was eager to demonstrate that her tolerance for recreational substances matched their peers. As a pre-club marijuana joint was passed around, she bragged that I can smoke the bollocks off you any day, matey, whilst when the pills were distributed with a suggestion that the women might want to moderate their consumption, Claire responded that she would neck what you do, Stewie. Inevitably, Claire ran into problems as she realized she was losing control and on a mad one. Asking herself, why didn't I take a half like Josie did? Claire's difficulties are compounded by her time of the month. Part of Claire's motivation to get, quote, right off my tits was the desire to forget all about her tampon. So Lifeline's explanatory notes on the back of the pamphlet made the moral of the story explicit. Women shouldn't try to match men pill for pill. noting that where once taking drugs and raving were thought of as boys only, Lifeline warned that, quote, a man and a woman can take the same amount of the same drug and feel totally different, because women's bodies are generally smaller than men's, making the effects of drugs feel much stronger. And as for Claire's unusual method for coping with her period, this was taken as a prompt to inform women that not only was such consumption inadvisable as a pain relief mechanism, but also that overindulgence could even make periods, quote, heavier or irregular. They may even stop. So Lifeline therefore leaned on biological differences between sexes, characterized women as both smaller physically and beholden to their menstrual cycles to question their intoxication. Lifeline addressed further issues of embodied femininity in their second leaflet, the E-Plan Diet. Seemingly suffering from body dysmorphia, Claire worried incessantly about her appearance in the club with Josie, comparing herself unfavorably to Destroy Girls, other women in the club, quote, all platforms and wonder bras. Josie tells her friend not to worry, and that in combination with, quote, some whiz, will soon eat the lard off our arses. The E-Plan diet also framed their practices in terms of a desire to be attractive, particularly to the opposite sex. Claire says, quote, she always dreamed of having legs like a Cindy doll, legs so long you couldn't walk. I'd just lay there while people queued up to admire me. Lifeline also mobilized the presence of men in nightclubs to urge caution in the next comic, Mr. Wonderful. Claire was once again the unfortunate protagonist, falling victim to ecstasy goggles when she spies an apparently attractive man on the dance floor, who Josie believes has a resemblance to the notoriously large-chinned football pundit Jimmy Hill. Having made out with this Mr. Wonderful, Claire loses him in the crowd until he reappears at the night's end, offering the two friends a ride to an after party. As the effects of the drugs wear off, both Josie and Claire were the subjects of unwelcome sexual advances of varying levels of persistence, but managed to make their escape. Lifeline warned its readers that, quote, he may look like Mr. Wonderful, but remember, whilst under the influence of drugs, people may seem more interesting and appealing, and the ecstasy, quote, may also lead to loss of inhibitions. So across these three publications, Lifeline presented an environment that they characterized elsewhere as club dangerous. Women were variously at risk of intoxication to the point of overdose, easy prey for predatory men, and reminded that ecstasy could provide only temporary respite for both the social and biological travails of being a young woman. Again, this illustrates that humor carries all sorts of assumptions. Comedy that appears to be edgy or transgressive can also perpetuate quite conservative values. But we should also be careful of projecting back our contemporary judgments on historical actors, despite evidence that suggests that Lifeline's efforts misread and misrepresented women's experiences in clubs. The topics contained in the leaflets were suggested by focus groups of young women ravers, and the characters developed in collaboration with them. When Lifeline researcher Sherlock evaluated the three leaflets with these focus groups, they received almost universal approval. Participants commented that, quote, the characters are very realistic, just what me and my mates are like, and that the leaflets were, quote, informative, funny, and have some good storylines. So to briefly conclude, what I've tried to demonstrate here is that Dante's suggestions for how we might usefully analyze humor in the archive is a useful starting point for getting at wider issues, even if we think, because of the shorter passage of time, that we still get the joke. Jokes are funny because of their context, their reference points, and who is laughing and at whom. Peanut Pete revealed how drug use in the north of Britain was situated in the material realities of and an escape from everyday life, while Claire and Josie doubled down on long-held gender stereotypes of intoxication. Thanks very much.